A cinematic story of power, betrayal, and a woman who was never just a wife. She sat at the wrong end of her own table and said nothing, because she didn't need to. The papers were already signed, the accounts were already frozen, and the man who thought he had won was already finished. He just didn't know it yet. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who needed you to survive, this story is for you. Watch until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Part 1. The Woman at the Wrong End of the Table. The ballroom smelled like money and old blood. Not literally. The Caruso Estate's private ballroom smelled like gardenias and imported candles that cost more per hour than most people made in a week. But underneath all of it, if you had grown up in a house like this, if you had spent 20 years learning to read every silence and every smile in rooms full of dangerous men, you learned to smell what was really in the air. Adriana Bellini Caruso could smell it tonight. Something was wrong. She stood at the top of the marble staircase for exactly 4 seconds before descending. 4 seconds was all she ever allowed herself. Enough time to assess a room, not long enough for anyone to notice she was doing it. She had learned that from her father before she was 12 years old, in a house not unlike this one, in a city that no longer existed the way she remembered it. The ballroom held 240 people. She knew this because she had approved the seating chart herself 6 weeks ago, had revised it twice, and had personally signed off on the placement of every table with the same attention she gave to legal briefs and financial instruments. 240 guests, all of them significant, capos and their wives. Rival family representatives attending under the unspoken protocol of a formal anniversary dinner. 3 sitting judges. A deputy mayor. 2 senators who did not technically exist in any capacity related to anything happening in this room tonight. Attorneys, developers, Port Authority officials, and a scattering of men whose professions on paper bore no resemblance to what they actually did. She had organized all of it. She had managed the RSVPs, the security rotations, the chef's tasting menu, the floral arrangements, the parking protocols, the gift acknowledgments, the background checks on 3 new serving staff. She had done it the way she did everything, without being asked, without being thanked, without anyone in the room quite grasping how comprehensively the evening would have collapsed without her. Vincenzo Caruso had approved the guest list in 40 seconds and told her the floral arrangement looked fine. She descended the staircase. The room shifted the way rooms always shifted when Adriana entered them, not the loud electric shift that happened when Vincenzo walked in, with his big shoulders and his practiced half-smile and the way men straightened instinctively in his presence. It was quieter than that. A murmur. A series of small recalibrations. Women noting her dress, dark emerald, understated, exactly right for the occasion. Men noting her composure. Everyone noting that she had not brought Vincenzo with her, which meant Vincenzo had not yet arrived, which meant something was slightly off from the program they'd been handed at the entrance. Adriana noticed all of this the way she noticed everything, cataloged it, filed it. She moved through the room with the particular grace of a woman who had long ago stopped needing approval from it. Eleonora Fanti caught her arm near the 3rd table. Eleonora, who had been married to Aldo Fanti for 31 years, and who had survived the kind of marriage that would have destroyed a lesser woman, and who communicated almost entirely through the angle of her chin and the quality of her silence. Tonight she said nothing at all. She simply looked at Adriana for a moment too long. "Eleonora," Adriana said warmly. "You look beautiful," Eleonora said, and then, very quietly, "Sit with me during the appetizers. I'm at the head table." Eleonora's expression did not change. "Of course," she said. "Stupid of me." She released Adriana's arm. The contact had lasted perhaps 2 seconds. In the mathematics of women who understood these rooms, 2 seconds of that particular grip was the equivalent of a shouted warning. Adriana moved on. She did not look toward the head table yet. She knew what was at the head table. She had arranged the head table. Her nameplate was there, beside Vincenzo's, at the position appropriate for the wife of the host at their 20th anniversary dinner. She knew exactly what her seat looked like, because she had approved the calligraphy on every nameplate 3 days ago and had run her thumb across the engraving of her own name, the way you touch something you made, checking for flaws. She stopped to greet Marco Tesoro, who ran port operations, and whose loyalty to Vincenzo was genuine in the uncomplicated way that loyalty based entirely on self-interest tends to be. She shook hands with Judge Carvalho's wife, whose name she remembered was Patricia, and who had a daughter studying architecture in Milan, and who had mentioned this at a previous dinner 18 months ago. She remembered because Adriana remembered everything. She remembered it the way she remembered account numbers and clauses and trust agreements, and the name of every capo's firstborn child, and the specific frequencies of silence that meant different things in different rooms. It was only when she reached the inner arc of the room, where the lighting was warmest and the tables most prominent, that she looked toward the head table for the first time. She saw it in 1.3 seconds, maybe less. The nameplate at the position to Vincenzo's right, her position, the position she had approved and arranged and confirmed, was gone. The crystal glass was still there. The charger plate was still there. The chair had been re-angled very slightly, the kind of small adjustment that might go unnoticed in a crowded room, but that was unmistakable once you were looking for it, because it was angled toward a person who was already sitting there. Sofia Marchetti was wearing a dress the color of champagne. She was 29 years old, and she was beautiful in the uncomplicated, obvious way that Adriana had never been beautiful. And she was sitting in Adriana's chair with the slightly careful posture of someone who was managing nervousness behind a composed expression and not quite succeeding. She had been Vincenzo's consigliere for 14 months. She had a law degree and quick instincts and the specific quality of ambition that announces itself through the precision of its calculations, which Adriana had recognized the first time she met her, and had noted the way you note weather on a horizon. Adriana stood still for exactly 1 second. Then she accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server, thanked him by name, his name was David, she had approved his security clearance, and walked toward the far end of the room to speak with Giuliana Moretti about her husband's recent hospitalization. Her heartbeat was entirely steady. This was not composure she was performing for the room. This was something older than that, something that had been forged in a childhood full of rooms that required absolute self-possession, and it was as natural to her now as breathing. But underneath it, in the part of her that she never showed anyone, something was tightening. She had known something was coming. She had known for months. What she had not known, what she was still calibrating, was exactly how public he intended to make it. Vincenzo Caruso entered the ballroom at 7:43, 14 minutes later than scheduled, and the room responded the way it always responded to him. He was a large man in the way that certain men are large, not just physically, though he was broad and tall with the kind of build that had always suggested capability, even before he had fully grown into it. He was large in the room in the particular atmospheric sense. He wore his suits the way generals wear uniforms, and he moved through spaces as though they had been arranged around him, which in this case they literally had been, though not by him. He paused at the entrance, scanned the room, found Adriana near the Moretti table, and held her gaze for a moment that told her nothing and everything simultaneously. Then he walked to the head table and sat down beside Sofia Marchetti. The room noticed. Rooms like this one always noticed. The noticing happened in small ways. A fork set down slightly more carefully than necessary, a wine glass lifted and then reconsidered, a murmured exchange between two wives that their husbands did not register, but that contained in the space of 8 words a complete assessment of what was happening. Adriana finished her sentence to Giuliana Moretti, something about a specialist in Zurich, and excused herself. She found her seat at the far end of the table, the position that had been reset. It was now clear, specifically so that there would be a seat for her that was not beside her husband on their 20th anniversary. Someone had moved her nameplate. She looked at the space in front of her. No nameplate, a glass, a charger, silverware in perfect order, and sat down. Across the room, she could feel the quality of attention shifting, thickening. People were watching the way people watch when they are trying to determine the nature of something dangerous, cautiously, peripherally, without wanting to be caught. Adriana unfolded her napkin, placed it in her lap, and reached for her water glass. Vincenzo rose at 8:15 to speak. He was good at speaking. This was not nothing. He had the voice for it. A low register that carried without effort, and that communicated authority in the straightforward way that some voices simply do, regardless of content. He had given hundreds of speeches in rooms like this. He thanked the guests. He acknowledged the occasion. He made 2 precisely calibrated jokes that landed well, and he named 3 people individually in a way that made each of them feel specifically honored. Then he said, 20 years ago, I built this family on strength and vision. Tonight, I want to talk about the future. Adriana lifted her wine glass. This organization has always adapted, Vincenzo continued. We've survived challenges that would have destroyed lesser families. And we've done it because we've been willing to evolve. He paused. Part of that evolution requires bringing new leadership into the center of what we do. Another pause. Theatrical, practiced. Sophia Marchetti has demonstrated a depth of legal understanding and strategic vision that this family needs. Effective immediately, she will assume oversight of all Caruso legitimate business operations. The future of this empire sits beside me tonight. There it was. Adriana heard the words with the particular clarity of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing and hears it arrive exactly as anticipated. She had known this was coming, not the exact words, not the precise staging, but the shape of it, the intention. She had known for 4 months. What she had not quite anticipated was the completeness of the humiliation. The phrase, "The future of this empire sits beside me tonight," in a room in which his wife of 20 years was sitting at the wrong end of the table, with no nameplate, on their anniversary. That was not just a business announcement. That was a message. It was delivered to every person in the room simultaneously. To the capos, to the rival family representatives, to the judges and the politicians and the Port Authority officials. It was delivered in the specific language of these rooms, where position and proximity are communication, and it said something very clear. She was finished. She was already gone. He had simply not informed her yet. Adriana set down her wine glass. She looked at the table in front of her. The charger plate, the silverware, the crystal. All of it arranged precisely because she had arranged it. All of it perfect because she had made it perfect. She had spent 6 weeks on this evening, and he had just used it as the set for her public execution. Her right hand was entirely still on the table. She thought about her father, about the specific thing he had told her when she was 15, standing in a room not unlike this one, watching a man she had trusted do something unforgivable. The ones who underestimate you, her father had said, are the ones who've been relying on you without knowing it. Let them show you who they are, then show them what that costs. She had never forgotten it. She had spent 4 months acting on it. The ballroom doors opened at 8:22. Not dramatically. They did not crash open. No one shouted. There was no cinematic surge of sound from outside. They simply opened, which was itself remarkable because the ballroom had been sealed since 8 o'clock, with Caruso security at every entrance point following standard protocol for a gathering of this nature. The doors were not supposed to open. The men stationed at them were not supposed to step aside. They stepped aside. The process server was a man in his mid-40s named Richard Howell, and he was entirely unremarkable in appearance. Medium height, reading glasses, a dark jacket that was slightly too warm for the season. He walked into the ballroom at a pace that suggested he had done things like this before, which he had, though never in quite a room like this one, and he walked with the specific quality of calm that belongs to people who understand that the document in their hand is the most powerful thing in the room. He walked past the first set of Caruso security, past the inner perimeter, past 2 capos who stared at him with expressions that could not quite process what they were looking at because it was so completely outside the categories of threat they had been trained to recognize. He walked to the head of the room. He stopped in front of Vincenzo Caruso. "Mr. Caruso," he said, and his voice was completely conversational, "I have documents for you. I need you to acknowledge receipt." The silence that fell over the ballroom was the particular silence of 240 people simultaneously ceasing to breathe. Vincenzo looked at the man in front of him the way he might look at something that had appeared by impossible means. His face went through several expressions very quickly: confusion, then irritation, then something harder to name. "Get him out," he said, to no one in particular, to everyone in earshot. Nobody moved. Richard Howell extended the envelope. "These are court-filed documents, Mr. Caruso. Refusal of service is not available to you. I'd encourage you to accept them." Vincenzo took the envelope. The taking of it was involuntary, almost the gesture of a man whose hands operated on a different protocol than his intentions. Richard Howells said, "Thank you, sir. Good evening." And then he turned and walked back through the ballroom, and the security at the door stepped aside again, and the doors closed behind him as quietly as they had opened. Vincenzo stared at the envelope. Sofia Marchetti, beside him, said nothing. Her hands had gone very still on the table. Adriana watched Vincenzo open the envelope. She watched him read the first document, which was the petition for dissolution of marriage. 38 pages of it, prepared by the firm of Hartwell, Quinn and Associates, a white-shoe legal operation that had represented 3 Fortune 100 companies and 2 former heads of state, and that operated with a discretion so absolute it was almost mythological. She watched him turn to the second document, which was the emergency court order, obtained the previous morning by the Honorable Catherine Delacroix of the Third Circuit on the basis of evidence submitted under seal. An order temporarily freezing all attempts to alter, transfer, or exercise voting authority related to shares and interests held by the Bellini Family Trust. The Bellini Family Trust. The thing he had spent 8 months trying to quietly seize. The thing that he had apparently calculated Adriana would never notice or never be able to stop. He looked up from the documents. He looked at Adriana. For 20 years she had been reading his face. She knew every register of it, every tell, every texture. She had watched him angry and triumphant and frightened and calculating and charming and cold. She had watched him be all of these things in the same afternoon and understand which one he was choosing in each moment. What she saw on his face right now was something she had never seen there before, and something that, despite everything, despite the 4 months and the attorneys and the forensic accountants and the private investigators and the late nights in her private office reconstructing 17 years of financial engineering, something that still required a specific resolution to witness. He looked lost. "You want to tell me what this is?" he said. His voice was very controlled. That was interesting. He was good at controlling his voice. Adriana set down her napkin on the table. She stood up. Across the room, 239 people watched her do this with the absolute attention of people watching something that will be discussed for the rest of their lives. "It's exactly what it looks like, Vincenzo," she said. Her voice carried without effort. She had never needed to raise it. "It's a divorce filing and an emergency order freezing the voting rights you've been attempting to transfer out of the Bellini Trust for the past 8 months. The court granted it yesterday afternoon." She paused. "The documentation supporting the order includes forensic accounting records covering 14 shell companies, 5 offshore accounts, and 3 fraudulent authorization instruments. The court found sufficient basis for an emergency ruling." The room was so silent she could hear the candles. "I'd also like to mention," she continued in the same even tone, "that the law firm representing the Bellini Trust interests has notified the relevant financial institutions, and the credit arrangements currently supporting the Caruso organization's expansion project have been suspended pending litigation." Vincenzo was staring at her. His face had moved through lost and arrived somewhere that was harder and colder, and still not the expression of a man with a plan. "The dining experience this evening was excellent," Adriana said. "I approved the menu myself." She glanced toward the table where Eleonora Fanti sat. Eleonora's chin had lifted by a fraction. "Please enjoy the rest of the evening." She walked toward the exit. She did not hurry. There was no reason to hurry. Everything was already in motion. Every legal instrument filed, every financial alert triggered, every document delivered. She had spent 4 months building a mechanism that did not require her to be present to function, but she had wanted to be present for this. She had wanted to be in the room when he understood. She was almost to the main doors when his voice came across the room. "Adriana." She stopped, turned. He was standing. The documents were in his hand. Beside him, Sofia Marchetti had not moved, and the expression on Sofia's face was something Adriana noted carefully. Not triumph, not fear, not the expression of a woman who had known this was coming, but something closer to a dawning and terrible understanding of her own position. "You think this is finished?" Vincenzo said. Adriana looked at him across 240 people, in the ballroom she had decorated, on the anniversary she had organized, in the marriage she had quietly constructed and maintained and now was quietly ending. "I think," she said, "that it's been finished for longer than you realize." She turned and walked through the doors. Outside, the night air was cool and dry, and the estate grounds were lit by string lights she had approved and installed and paid for. She walked to the car without her security escort. She had sent them home 3 hours ago. And she sat in the back seat of a car driven by a woman named Claudette, who had been driving for the Bellini family for 11 years and who said nothing because Adriana had not asked her to say anything. The car moved down the long driveway. Adriana looked out the window at the stone walls of the Caruso estate moving past and thought about something that had occurred to her approximately 6 weeks ago, in the middle of a night she had spent going through records, and that she had not been able to fully put out of her mind since. She had found something in the financial records, something that was not connected to Vincenzo's scheme, not directly. A series of transfers, carefully obscured, moving through a subsidiary she had not seen referenced in any document Vincenzo had ever shown her. The transfers were small in the context of the Caruso operation, almost invisible. They traced back through 4 intermediary accounts to a legal entity she did not recognize. The legal entity traced back to a name. Not Vincenzo's name, not Sophia's. A name she had not been expecting. A name that, when she had first seen it, had required her to set down every document she was holding and sit very still for approximately 30 seconds before she could think clearly again. She had not included it in the divorce filing. She had not included it in the emergency court order. She had not mentioned it to her attorneys because she was not yet certain what it meant, and she had not become the woman she was by acting on things she was not yet certain about. The car reached the gate. Adriana looked at her reflection in the dark window glass. Composed. Still. The woman who had just dismantled the most powerful crime organization in the region with paperwork and patience, who had done it in a room full of dangerous men without raising her voice, who had walked away from 20 years of her life with the particular steadiness of someone who had already grieved it in private months ago, so that she would not need to grieve it publicly tonight. She was not thinking about Vincenzo. She was thinking about the name on the document, about what it meant, about the fact that if she was reading it correctly, the person who had actually conceived the scheme to strip her of the Bellini trust, the person who had identified the vulnerability in the trust structure, who had recruited Vincenzo's ambition and channeled it and used it as a tool, was someone she had trusted in a different way than she had trusted Vincenzo, someone she had never suspected, someone who was still, as far as she knew, entirely unsuspected by everyone. Claudette asked if she wanted music. "No," Adriana said. "Thank you." The gate opened. The car moved through. The estate disappeared behind them. In the ballroom she had just left, 240 people were sitting with the wreckage of a dinner she had planned, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Vincenzo Caruso was standing at the head of a table with divorce papers in his hand, in a room full of the most powerful men in the organization, and the world as he had understood it for 20 years had just ended in front of all of them. It had taken 4 months. It had taken 14 forensic accountants, 3 investigators, 1 elite legal firm, and a trust document her father had written 15 years ago that contained a clause even she had not fully understood until 6 weeks ago. But there was something else. There was still the name on the document. There was still the question of what it meant and who knew and what was actually happening beneath the things she thought she had uncovered. Adriana Bellini Caruso had just won the most public battle of her life. She was beginning to understand that it might not be the most important one. The name was Renato Luca. Adriana had stared at it for 30 seconds the night she first found it. She had been sitting at the desk in her private study, not the shared office she used for estate administration, not the room Vincenzo knew about, but the smaller room on the 3rd floor that she had been using for 4 months, the one with the locked drawer and the second laptop that connected through a routing service her cybersecurity consultant had configured. 30 seconds of stillness. Then she had written the name on a piece of paper, folded the paper, and locked it in the drawer. She had not written it again. She had not typed it. She had carried it in her head the way you carry something that is too fragile or too dangerous to put down. Renato Luca was Vincenzo's attorney, had been, for 11 years. He was 63 years old, silver-haired, and possessed of the particular quality of trustworthiness that certain men constructed with the patience of architects. Not performed, not false exactly, but engineered, like a building designed to withstand inspection. He had drawn up contracts, negotiated acquisitions, managed the legal architecture of the Caruso legitimate empire with a precision that Vincenzo had always attributed to loyalty. What Adriana had found, buried in 4 layers of subsidiary transfers and obscured by 2 sets of books that she was not supposed to know existed, was that Renato Luca had been systematically identifying vulnerabilities in the Bellini family trust for at least 3 years before Vincenzo had made his first move toward it. He had found the gap in the authorization structure. He had mapped it. He had designed the instrument that Vincenzo had used to attempt the transfer. He had not done it at Vincenzo's instruction. The timeline was wrong for that. The earliest traces predated Vincenzo's first documented interest in the trust by 14 months. Renato Luca had gone looking for this on his own. The question that had kept Adriana awake for 6 weeks, that was keeping her awake now, in the back of the car, with the estate receding behind her and the night coming in flat and cold through the glass, was why. Claudette dropped her at the apartment on the 7th floor of a building in the Meridian district, a place Adriana had leased under a name connected to a corporate entity that connected to nothing recognizable. She had begun using it 4 months ago. It had a bed, a kitchen, a desk, a window that looked out over the river. She had taken almost nothing from the estate. A few changes of clothes, her laptop, 3 files she had assembled herself and carried in a case that did not leave her possession. She sat at the desk at 11:15 and opened the file on Renato Luca. It was not a large file. She was careful about what she committed to paper or to any digital surface she did not fully control. But it contained what she had been able to construct from the financial traces, dates, amounts, the names of intermediary entities, a map of transfers that, taken together, told a story she still did not fully understand. She looked at it for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called Marcus Webb. Marcus was 41 and former federal financial crimes investigation, which meant he understood how money moved through structures designed to make it invisible. And he had been working for the Bellini family in a private capacity for 6 years, and he was one of 4 people Adriana trusted with information that could destroy her. She had not told him about Renato yet. She told him now, not everything, but enough. When she finished, there was a silence on the line. "How old are the earliest traces?" Marcus asked. 3 years, 2 months. Another silence. "That's not opportunism. That's a project." "Yes." "Does Vincenzo know?" "I don't think so. The architecture of the scheme suggests Vincenzo was being managed, not directing. He was given a goal and a path to it. He didn't design the path. So someone built the trap and pointed Vincenzo at it. That's what the evidence suggests. Pointed him at what exactly? The trust, or at you?" Adriana was quiet for a moment. "That," she said, "is the question I need you to help me answer." She told him what she needed. She listened to him not argue about it, which was one of the reasons she trusted him. They established a timeline. She ended the call at 11:58 and sat for a while in the dark apartment with the city moving below her and the file open on the desk. She thought about Renato Luca, about the 11 years he had spent as Vincenzo's attorney, seated at tables where Adriana was also seated, attending the same dinners, the same family gatherings, the same negotiations. 11 years of a performance so complete that she had never once questioned it. She was questioning it now. She was also aware, and this was the part that required a particular quality of cold honesty to sit with, that she had missed it. She had missed it for 3 years, possibly longer. The woman who noticed everything, who had built an invisible architecture of financial protection around an empire whose owner didn't know she was doing it, who had spent 20 years reading every room she entered, had not read this one. She closed the file. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. Vincenzo called at 6:47 the next morning. She let it ring. He called again at 6:52. Again at 7:03. She made coffee and stood at the window watching the river and let him call. At 7:21, her attorney called instead. "He's contacted us," Elena Hartwell said. Her voice was the temperature of something recently removed from a freezer. Elena was 54 and had negotiated outcomes that would have made most people physically ill, and she did not frighten easily. But her voice this morning had a specific quality that Adriana noted. He wants an emergency meeting. His attorney is requesting a 48-hour hold on the court order. His attorney, Adriana said. Which attorney? Renato Luca. Adriana set down her coffee cup very carefully on the counter. Deny the request. No hold, no meeting. He's also indicated he may pursue an injunction challenging the emergency order on procedural grounds. Let him. Adriana. Elena paused, and the pause contained something. He mentioned the Pharaoh situation. The Pharaoh situation. Adriana stood very still. The Pharaoh situation was a thing that had happened 9 years ago, a thing that Adriana had managed with the same invisible efficiency she brought to everything, a thing that had required her to make a specific set of decisions that she stood behind entirely, but that existed in documented form in a place that was supposed to be inaccessible. It was not something she had ever discussed with Elena. It was not something she had discussed with anyone. Vincenzo knowing about it was impossible, which meant Renato Luca had found it. How specific was he? Adriana asked. Specific enough that I need to know what it is before I can advise you on exposure. Adriana looked out at the river. A barge was moving slowly through the gray morning water, unhurried, heavy with cargo she couldn't identify. I'll come to your office at 9, she said. Come alone. She told Elena enough of it. Not all of it. She had told no one all of it and had no intention of starting, but enough that Elena understood the shape of the vulnerability and could assess it legally. She watched Elena's face while she explained, watched the precise professional composure that Elena maintained through things that would have disrupted lesser practitioners, and she saw the moment, brief, contained, when Elena understood what they were dealing with. This is what he's using as leverage, Elena said, attempting to. It's not nothing, Adriana. I know. If it surfaces in the wrong, I know, Adriana said again. Her voice was flat, not hard, just flat. That's why I'm here. I need to understand my actual exposure, not my theoretical exposure. Elena spent 12 minutes walking through it. The legal landscape, the documentation that existed versus the documentation that would need to be produced. The specific question of whether what had happened 9 years ago constituted something actionable or something merely uncomfortable. She was thorough and she was honest, and by the end of it, Adriana had a clear picture. The picture was not comfortable, but it was manageable. He thinks it's bigger than it is, Adriana said when Elena finished. Possibly. Or he has more documentation than you know about. If Renato found it, he found the surface of it. What's underneath the surface is documented differently and in a place Renato doesn't have access to. Are you certain? Adriana thought about this for exactly the amount of time it deserved. Certain enough, she said. Elena looked at her across the desk. 22 years of legal practice and the specific experience of watching powerful people navigate moments that define them. What do you want to do? Nothing, Adriana said. We do nothing. We don't respond to the leverage. We don't acknowledge it. We continue on the timeline we established. She paused. If he wants to escalate, he'll have to escalate in a direction that exposes more about what he did than about what I did. That's a calculated risk. Everything I've done for 4 months is a calculated risk. Elena was quiet for a moment. Then, there's something else you should know. Luca filed a motion this morning, not related to the divorce. He filed on behalf of a corporate entity called Meridian Capital Solutions, challenging the trust freeze order on the basis that Meridian holds a legitimate creditor interest in Bellini Trust assets. Adriana went still. Meridian Capital Solutions. The building where she was sleeping was in the Meridian district. She had chosen it for that reason, a minor misdirection, the kind of small private joke she allowed herself, a name that meant nothing and appeared on no document connected to the Bellini family. Meridian Capital Solutions was the name of one of Renato Luca's shell companies. When was Meridian incorporated? Adriana asked. Elena checked her notes. 14 months ago. 14 months ago. 3 months before Vincenzo had made his first documented move on the trust. Renato had been laying groundwork before Vincenzo even started moving. "He's not just the architect," Adriana said, mostly to herself. "What?" "He's the beneficiary." She looked at Elena. "Vincenzo was never going to get control of the trust. Luca designed it so Vincenzo would take the legal and criminal exposure for the attempt, while Meridian, Luca's company, established a creditor claim that would survive the divorce litigation. If it had worked, Vincenzo would have been caught, and Luca would have walked away with a legitimate court-recognized claim on Bellini assets worth—" She did the calculation in her head. Conservatively, 300 million. The silence in Elena's office was very complete. "He used Vincenzo," Elena said. "He used both of us. Vincenzo to make the move, me as the target." Adriana's hands were flat on the desk. Still, Vincenzo isn't the predator in this story. He's the weapon. And that's it. She did not go back to the apartment. She drove instead to a building in the warehouse district that housed, on its third floor, the offices of Web Investigative Consulting, which was not the kind of firm that advertised, and whose clients were not the kind of clients who appeared on any publicly accessible record. Marcus Webb met her at the door. He was a lean man with the kind of face that disclosed nothing by default, and that Adriana had always found reassuring for that reason. "You found something," he said, looking at her. "Tell me everything you have on Meridian Capital Solutions." They sat in his office for 2 hours. Marcus had been working since their call the previous night. 4 hours of digging through corporate filings, property records, financial disclosures, and the particular kind of forensic mapping that required both expertise and the willingness to go to places that were technically adjacent to legal. What he had built was incomplete, but it was enough. Renato Luca had been planning this for 4 years, not 3. The earliest traces Marcus had found were 4 years old. A consultation with a trust law specialist in another city, conducted under a name that traced back to Luca through 2 degrees of corporate separation. He had identified the Bellini Trust structural vulnerability 4 years ago and had spent the time since constructing a legal and financial architecture designed to exploit it. "He consulted with someone," Marcus said, pulling up a document on his screen. "The trust specialist he used 4 years ago. Name is Dr. Philip Crane. Crane is semi-retired, but he's considered one of the top 3 trust law theorists in the country. Specifically, he's the expert on the Bellini trust structure." Adriana looked at the screen. "How do you mean?" "Crane wrote his doctoral thesis on multi-generational family trust structures in organized crime adjacent families. He published a version of it, sanitized, fictional names, about 20 years ago. One of the case studies in it is, pretty clearly, the Bellini Trust." Marcus looked at her. He knew about the authorization gap before Luca found him. He identified it academically as a theoretical vulnerability in a published paper that's been sitting in legal libraries for 20 years. Adriana sat back. "Luca read the paper," she said. "That would be my read." And then he found Crane and had a consultation to confirm that the theoretical vulnerability was real and exploitable. And then spent 4 years building the mechanism to exploit it. Adriana looked at the far wall of Marcus's office. There was nothing on it, bare concrete, the kind of surface you looked at when you were looking through something rather than at it. Her father had hired the firm that structured the Bellini Trust. He had hired the best people, people he trusted, people who understood the family's specific needs and circumstances. He had done it the way he did everything, carefully, thoroughly, with the particular paranoid intelligence of a man who had survived long enough to know that nothing lasted unless you built it to. And somewhere in that building, he had left a gap, not through carelessness, through the limits of what any person could foresee. And a man she had known for 11 years had found the gap and spent 4 years building a key to fit it. "There's something else," Marcus said. He pulled up another document, a property record. A transfer of ownership on a residential property, a house in a coastal town 3 hours from the city, transferred 14 months ago to an LLC that traced back, through the same degree of separation as everything else Luca touched, to the same structure. The previous owner of the house was Sofia Marchetti. Adriana looked at the document for a long moment. "He bought property from her," she said, "or the LLC did, at market rate, Nothing suspicious about the transaction on its surface. But the timing. Marcus pointed at the date. 14 months ago, which is exactly when Sofia was brought in as Vincenzo's consigliere. Luca didn't just design the scheme, Adriana said slowly. He placed Sofia. Marcus said nothing. He didn't need to. Adriana thought about Sofia Marchetti, 29 years old, champagne-colored dress, the careful posture of someone managing nervousness. She thought about the expression she had seen on Sofia's face at the moment the process server handed Vincenzo the documents. Not triumph, not fear. Something closer to dawning understanding. Sofia had not known, or had not known everything. Renato Luca had positioned her, given her the opportunity, facilitated her introduction to Vincenzo's inner circle, possibly engineered the very circumstances that had made her seem indispensable. And Sofia had taken it, the way an ambitious 29-year-old takes an opportunity that appears in front of her without fully understanding who had placed it there or why. "Where's Luca now?" Adriana asked. "His office, as of an hour ago. He has a meeting scheduled this afternoon with a partner at his firm. He filed the Meridian motion remotely this morning." Marcus paused. "He doesn't know you know about him." "No." Adriana stood up. "And I need to keep it that way for a specific period of time." "How long?" She thought about the succession clause in her father's trust document, about the meeting she had already scheduled 10 days from now, with 3 commission representatives who had agreed to hear a formal presentation, about the 14 things that needed to happen in a precise sequence in order for the outcome she intended to actually occur. 10 days, she said. Maybe 12. And then? Adriana picked up her bag. Then we show him what the gap in the trust actually does. She left Marcus's office and stood for a moment in the corridor outside, with the concrete walls and the industrial lighting and the particular quality of silence that exists in buildings that don't want to be noticed. She pressed her back against the wall and took 3 slow breaths. This was the part she had not told anyone, the part she had been carrying alone, because it was the part that changed the shape of everything. Because if Renato Luca had spent 4 years building this, if he had placed Sofia and managed Vincenzo and designed the creditor claim, and read Crane's academic paper and done all of it with the patience and precision of a man who understood exactly how trust structures worked, then there was one more thing she needed to know. Her father had written the succession clause, the clause that voided any attempt to seize the trust through deception. He had written it 15 years ago, and it was sealed, and it had been kept in a safe that only she and her attorney knew about, because her father had told her, when he was dying, that it existed, and where it was and what it said, and that she should keep it sealed until the day she needed it. She had needed it last night. She had used it. But her father had also told her something else, something he had said in the last weeks of his life, in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and the specific grief of things running out. He had said, "The clause has a partner provision. I had 2 men draft it. One of them I trust completely. The other one I was never sure about. If you ever need the clause, find out first whether the man I wasn't sure about knows it exists." She had been so focused on Vincenzo, on the divorce filing, on the emergency order, on the succession clause itself. She had not yet determined which of the 2 men who drafted it she needed to be worried about. She knew now who her father's attorney had been 15 years ago. She had known it for 6 weeks, and she had been avoiding the full weight of what it meant, because what it meant was that Renato Luca had known about the succession clause for 15 years, that he had drafted it, and that everything, the 4 years of preparation, the academic paper, the shell companies, the Meridian creditor claim, Sofia, all of it, might have been designed not to exploit a gap in the trust, but to neutralize the clause that was supposed to protect it. She stood in the corridor with this understanding sitting in her chest like something cold. She had filed the succession clause last night. She had put it into the court record. She had used it as the instrument of Vincenzo's final defeat, in a room full of 240 witnesses, in a filing that was now a matter of public court record. If Luca had known about the clause for 15 years and had spent 4 years building a mechanism to neutralize it, then she had just done exactly what he had been waiting for her to do. She had shown him the weapon. She had used it publicly. And if his counter mechanism was already in place, already filed, already triggered, already moving through a legal architecture she hadn't yet fully mapped, then the succession clause she had just exposed might not protect her the way she believed it would. She pushed off the wall. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. Everything on the outside of her was exactly the same as it always was, because she had been trained from childhood to keep the outside steady regardless of what was happening underneath, and that training did not fail her now. But she was moving faster than she had been moving 10 minutes ago. She called Elena from the car. "The succession clause," she said, the moment Elena picked up. "Who outside your firm has had access to the filed copy in the last 72 hours? A pause. "It was filed under seal. Who had access?" "The presiding clerk, Judge Delacroix's assistant, the opposing counsel of record, which is Renato Luca." Silence. "He received the filing this morning," Elena said. "Standard disclosure. Adriana, if it's under seal, he can't—" "He drafted it," Adriana said, 15 years ago. "He already knows what it says. What I need to know is whether he's had 15 years to find the one provision inside it that doesn't hold." The silence on the line was different now, heavier. "There's a challenge mechanism," Elena said slowly. "In trust law, a clause inserted by the drafting attorney, a procedural backdoor that allows the original drafter to petition for review on the basis of drafting error or changed circumstance. It's obscure. Most practitioners never use it, but if Luca inserted that mechanism into the original document, he could challenge the clause he wrote. And if he challenges it before the divorce proceeding reaches the asset division phase, the clause is suspended pending review," Adriana finished. She looked out at the street moving past. People, traffic, the ordinary machinery of a city that did not know what was happening inside this car. "How long do we have before he can file the challenge?" she asked. "If he moves today, 72 hours, maybe less." Adriana did the calculation. 10 days had just become 3. "Then we move tonight," she said. "Get me the commission contacts, all of them. And Elena—" She paused. "Find me everything Renato Luca has ever filed in trust court. Every case, every motion, every procedural instrument." She paused. "He built a door into that clause. I need to find it before he walks through it." The call ended. The car moved through traffic, and Adriana sat in the back of it with the cold understanding that the war she thought she had already won had, in the last 20 minutes, revealed itself to be something considerably larger, and that the man she had never suspected was now the only thing standing between her and everything she had built. The files arrived at Elena's office at 9:14 that evening. Marcus had pulled them. Every trust court filing Renato Luca had ever attached his name to. 41 cases over 30 years, a career's worth of legal architecture laid out across 612 pages of motions, petitions, amendments, and procedural instruments. Adriana sat at Elena's conference table with her jacket off and her sleeves rolled to the elbow and a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, and she read. Elena worked beside her. 2 associates Elena trusted worked at the far end of the table, cross-referencing specific instruments against a database of trust law precedents. The room smelled like printer toner, and the particular staleness of recycled air pushed too long through a building's ventilation system. Nobody talked unless they had something to say. At 10:51, one of the associates, a young woman named Grace, who had the specific quality of stillness that belongs to people who are very good at finding things, set a document in front of Elena without a word. Elena read it. Then she passed it to Adriana. It was a filing from 11 years ago, a trust challenge case unrelated to the Bellini family, in which Renato Luca had represented the challenging party. The case had settled before ruling, but embedded in Luca's motion, on page 7, in a subordinate clause of a procedural argument, was a legal framework he had constructed around what trust law called a drafting party review petition. The framework was elegant in the way that truly dangerous things tend to be elegant. It argued that an attorney who had materially participated in drafting a trust instrument retained a standing interest in its correct interpretation, and that this standing survived the original engagement, could be exercised at any time. The instrument was invoked in adversarial proceedings, and, this was the part that made Adriana's jaw tighten, operated independently of which party the attorney currently represented. He had built the argument 11 years ago. He had tested it in a case that settled before it could be ruled upon, which meant it had never been challenged in court, which meant it existed in legal space as an untested but documented theory bearing his name. He's going to file it tomorrow, Adriana said. Almost certainly, Elena said. And because it's never been ruled on, no precedent exists to block it. The judge would have to hear it. It would take, Elena did the calculation, 6 to 10 days to brief, respond, and schedule a hearing, during which time the succession clause sits in procedural limbo, and the asset division phase of the divorce cannot proceed while the clause is under challenge. Correct. Adriana looked at the document in her hands. Page 7, a subordinate clause, 11 years ago. He had been patient in a way that was almost incomprehensible, the patience of someone who had identified a target and constructed his approach over a time frame that most people did not think in, because most people did not operate from that particular combination of intelligence and appetite and absolute willingness to wait. She set the document down, picked up her cold coffee, drank it. "What's our counter?" she asked. Elena was quiet for a moment that was slightly too long. "There isn't a clean one. If he files the petition tomorrow, we respond, we brief. We argue that his standing lapsed with the original engagement. We have a reasonable argument, but reasonable isn't certain, and in the window between filing and ruling, he has time to move the Meridian claim forward." Yes. Adriana looked at the ceiling for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked back at the table. "Call Judge Delacroix's clerk first thing in the morning. I want to know if Luca's office has been in contact with the court today. If they have, then he's not filing tomorrow. He already filed tonight." She stood up. "I need an hour alone. Use the conference room. I'll be in your office." She sat in Elena's chair behind Elena's desk and called a number she had not called in 3 years. It rang 4 times. Then a voice she recognized, older now, slower, but still carrying the particular weight of a man who had once been formidable and knew it. "Adriana," said Commissioner Aldo Fanti. Not surprised, he had been expecting her call, which meant Eleonora had told him, and Eleonora had told him because Eleonora had understood, from the grip on Adriana's arm in the ballroom, that the call was coming. "I need 3 days of your time," Adriana said. "You need more than that. 3 days is what I'm asking for." A pause. She could hear him breathing, the slow, careful breath of a man with a compromised lung who had survived things that should have killed him and was aware of this every time he inhaled. "What do you know?" he asked. "Enough." "Luca?" She was quiet for a beat. "You knew." Not a question. The silence told her. The specific quality of the pause, not surprise, not confusion, but something closer to a man deciding what to admit. "I suspected," Aldo said, "for about 18 months. I didn't have anything I could move on." "Why didn't you come to me?" "Because I wasn't certain what he knew about the clause. And because if I came to you and I was wrong, I put you in motion against a man who would have known the motion was coming." Another slow breath. "You were safer not moving. As long as you didn't use the clause, he had nothing to work with. And when I used it last night, you gave him his moment." A pause. "I'm sorry, Adriana." She sat with that for exactly the amount of time it deserved, which was not long. "I need the commission," she said. "Not in 10 days. I need an emergency session. 72 hours. "That's not, Aldo." Her voice was flat. Not raised, not sharp, flat. "He drafted the succession clause. He built a door into it 11 years ago, and he has been waiting 15 years to use it. If he files his petition tomorrow and the clause goes into limbo, every legitimate asset connected to the Bellini Trust becomes vulnerable for the duration of the challenge. We're talking about holdings in 7 countries, 3 port operations, 11 real estate entities, and a charitable foundation that currently employs 412 people. He doesn't need to win the challenge. He just needs it to run long enough for Meridian to establish the creditor claim." The silence was different now. "How much does Vincenzo know?" Aldo asked. "About Luca?" "Nothing. Vincenzo thought he was running his own scheme. He was a vehicle." "Does he know that?" "Not yet." Another pause, longer this time. She could hear Aldo thinking, the specific quality of a man reassembling a picture he had been looking at wrong. If Vincenzo understands he was used, Aldo said slowly, he becomes a different variable. Yes. You're going to tell him. I'm going to give him the opportunity to be useful, Adriana said, which is not the same thing. Silence. Then, quietly, your father would have done exactly that. She did not respond to this. 72 hours, Aldo. A long exhale. I can get you 4 commissioners, not the full body. 4 is enough to establish preliminary findings. I don't need a vote. I need witnesses. All right? A pause. Adriana, whatever Luca has on you, the thing Vincenzo mentioned last night, whatever he's planning to use, it's manageable. Are you certain? She thought about the Pharaoh situation, about what Renato Luca knew, and what he thought he knew, and the specific distance between those two things. Certain enough, she said. She ended the call. She sat for a moment in Elena's chair in Elena's office, with the city outside going about its night, and she pressed both hands flat against the desk surface and breathed. In, out, slow. Then she picked up the phone again and called a number she had never expected to call. Sofia Marchetti answered on the second ring, which meant she had been awake, which meant she had not slept, which Adriana had anticipated. Mrs. Caruso, Sofia said, and her voice had the careful quality of someone stepping onto ice they were not sure would hold. We need to talk, Adriana said. Tonight, not over the phone. A pause. Why would I? Because Renato Luca bought your house, Adriana said. 14 months ago. Through an LLC you probably didn't know he controlled, and I think you've had 18 months to wonder why an attorney you barely knew was suddenly so interested in helping you get close to my husband. The silence on the line was the particular silence of a person who has been carrying something heavy and has just heard someone else name it. Where? Sofia asked. They met at a coffee shop in a neighborhood that neither of them had any connection to, at 12:40 in the morning, when the place was occupied only by 2 insomniacs and a barista who was too tired to be interested in them. Adriana arrived first. Sofia arrived 7 minutes later, and she looked like someone who had been crying and had stopped and had put herself back together with the imperfect efficiency of someone doing it too fast. She was 29 years old. Sitting across from her in the flat fluorescent light of a place that smelled like burnt espresso, Adriana could see exactly how young that was. How long did you know? Adriana asked. No preamble, no warmth. About what specifically? About any of it. Sofia wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Her knuckles were slightly white. I knew Vincenzo wanted to restructure the business operations. I knew there was a legal component. I didn't know... She stopped. You didn't know it was fraud. Not at first. Her jaw tightened. By the time I understood what the authorization transfers actually were, the position I was in. You were in deep enough that stepping back looked worse than moving forward. Sofia looked at the table. Yes. And Luca? A pause. He introduced himself as Vincenzo's attorney. He was helpful. He facilitated things, made introductions. The position with Vincenzo's organization, I thought I'd earned it. I thought it was about my work. When did you start to think it wasn't? Sofia looked up. Her eyes were dry now, the crying finished, something harder underneath it. About 4 months ago. He started asking me questions that were specific in ways that didn't make sense if he was just Vincenzo's attorney. About the trust documents, about your schedule, about which financial advisors you used personally versus the ones you used for estate administration. A pause. He was mapping you. Adriana absorbed this. Did you tell him anything? No? The word came out quick and clean. Whatever else was complicated about Sofia Marchetti, this part apparently wasn't. I told him I didn't have access to that information, which was true. And then I started being careful around him. I didn't know what he was building, but I knew it was something I didn't want to be inside. But you stayed. I didn't know how to leave without... Sofia stopped again. started again. He knows things about me. From before. The kind of things a person uses. Adriana looked at her steadily. What kind of things? My brother has debts, the kind you don't take to a bank. Luca, when I first met him, he helped. He made a call and the problem went away and I was grateful and I didn't think... Her voice thinned slightly. I didn't think clearly about what that meant. He had recruited her the same way he'd recruited everything else in this scheme. He'd found the gap in the structure and he'd inserted himself into it and he'd waited. In Sophia's case, the gap was a brother with dangerous debts. He had made himself indispensable before she understood what he was. And by the time she understood, the leverage was already in place. Do you have documentation? Adriana asked. Anything he sent you, asked you to do? Any communication that establishes his role? Sophia reached into her bag. She put a phone on the table, an older model, a secondary device. She pushed it across to Adriana. Everything is on here. Encrypted, but Marcus Webb will know how to open it. Yes, I know who he is. Luca mentioned him when he was warning me about you. Adriana looked at the phone on the table. He told me you were the threat, Sophia said quietly. He built an entire picture of you. Controlling, vindictive. A woman who had spent 20 years holding Vincenzo back and who would destroy anyone who tried to help him grow. She paused. He was very convincing. He's had 15 years to practice. Sophia's eyes met hers. I'm sorry. For the position I was in, for how it looked. Adriana picked up the phone. She turned it over once in her hands. She thought about 29 and ambitious and a brother with debts and a man who was very good at finding gaps. She thought about how easy it was to be used when someone was skilled enough at using people that you didn't feel the mechanism until you were already inside it. Go home, Adriana said. Don't contact Luca. Don't contact Vincenzo. Don't contact anyone until I reach out to you. Sophia nodded. She started to stand, then stopped. Mrs. Caruso, what he has on me, the leverage. Is your brother still in debt? No, Luca settled it through Meridian. Which means Meridian holds the debt instrument now instead of whoever held it before. Adriana stood and picked up her bag. When Meridian ceases to exist as a legal entity, which it will, the debt instrument becomes unenforceable. Your brother is fine. She paused. Go home, Sophia. She left the coffee shop. Outside, the air was cold and the street was empty in the way that streets are empty at 1 a.m. Not silent, but stripped down, the daytime noise gone and only the bass line remaining. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at the phone in her hand. She had what she needed for the commission presentation. Sophia's documentation. Marcus's financial mapping. Elena's legal analysis of the drafting petition. The sealed succession clause already in the court record. 4 commissioners who would hear her in 72 hours. She had almost everything, except that at 1:17 in the morning, her phone rang and it was Marcus, and the quality of his voice when he said her name was not the voice he used when he had information. It was the voice he used when something had already happened that he could not stop. Talk, she said. Luca didn't file the drafting petition, Marcus said. Then what? He withdrew from the case entirely, resigned as Vincenzo's counsel of record. An hour ago. A pause. And Adriana, he filed a voluntary disclosure with the Federal Financial Crimes Division. This evening, he gave them everything. The shell companies, the offshore accounts, the authorization transfers, the Meridian structure. Another pause, and this one was the kind that preceded something that changed the shape of a room. He gave them Vincenzo, the whole scheme, documented and packaged, in exchange for immunity. Adriana stood on the empty street and felt the architecture of the last 4 months shift under her feet. He flipped, she said, before you could expose him. He went to the federal investigators first, gave them Vincenzo's operation on a plate, and walked away clean with immunity and a cooperating witness agreement. The Meridian claim. Withdrawn this afternoon, before the divorce filing even hit the news cycle. He dissolved the creditor claim before anyone could formally challenge it. Adriana understood what had happened in the space of approximately 4 seconds. Renato Luca had not been neutralized. He had neutralized himself, deliberately, surgically, in a way that left him untouchable. He had given up the scheme he had built, given up Vincenzo, given up Meridian, given up everything. And in doing so, he had stepped out of the line of fire before the gun she was pointing arrived at the position where he had been standing. "The immunity agreement," she said. "How broad is it?" "That's the part you need to hear." Marcus's voice was careful now, in the way it was careful when he was delivering something he knew would land badly. The disclosure Luca gave the investigators, it didn't just cover Vincenzo's operation. She waited. "He included the Pharaoh situation," Marcus said. 9 years ago. All of it. He had documentation she'd never known about, things she had not known existed, records from a source she had never identified, assembled into a package that described not just what had happened, but her specific role in it and the decisions she had made at every stage. Her breath came out of her slowly. "The immunity agreement insulates him from anything connected to the disclosure," Marcus continued, "including accessory liability for any of the Pharaoh documentation, which means he can give it to investigators without personal exposure. And Adriana—" A pause. "They're going to want to talk to you, the investigators. Within 48 hours, probably. Luca structured the disclosure so that your involvement in Pharaoh appears as a thread in the same investigation as Vincenzo's fraud. You're not a target, not yet, but you're a subject." She stood on the sidewalk. The cold air came in through her coat. The city moved around her at its 1 a.m. pace, indifferent and continuous. Renato Luca had not been trying to steal from the Bellini Trust. He had not been trying to neutralize the succession clause. He had been doing something more patient and more devastating than either of those things. He had been building a case, against Vincenzo, yes, but with Adriana adjacent to it, close enough to be pulled in, the Pharaoh documentation serving as the thread that connected her to the same investigation. And he had been waiting for her to move so that when he flipped, the picture he gave the investigators included her in motion. She had filed the divorce. She had triggered the succession clause. She had put herself in public, active, visible opposition to Vincenzo's operation. And Luca had used all of it as context for a federal disclosure that made her look like a participant rather than a victim. He had not built a trap for Vincenzo. He had built a trap for her. Vincenzo was just the mechanism. The divorce, the court filings, the emergency order, all of it had been steps she was always going to take, steps he had anticipated, steps that placed her exactly where he needed her to be when he walked into the federal building and opened his mouth. She had not won the night of the banquet. She had triggered the final phase of someone else's plan. Marcus was still on the line. She could hear him not speaking, giving her the time she needed, which was the quality in him she valued most right now. "Marcus," she said. Her voice was very steady. This was not composure she was managing. This was something that had gone past composure into a place she did not have a name for. A place where the ground has disappeared and your body hasn't registered it yet, and you are still standing on air. "I need you to find me one thing." "Name it." "The source of the Pharaoh documentation. Whatever Luca gave the investigators, it came from somewhere. He had records that should not exist. I need to know where they came from." "That's going to take— I know how long it's going to take. Start now." She paused. "And Marcus, whatever you find, whatever name is at the end of that chain, I need you to be prepared for the possibility that it's someone we haven't considered yet." She ended the call. She looked at the street, at the city, at the particular quality of a night that had shifted, in the space of a 4-minute phone call, from something navigable into something she was going to have to rebuild her entire approach to survive. The succession clause was in the court record. The divorce was filed. Vincenzo was exposed. Luca was untouchable. The federal investigators were 48 hours from her door, and somewhere, connected to a chain of documentation that should not exist, was a source she had not found yet, a person who had been watching the Pharaoh situation for 9 years, with the patience to wait until the exact moment when producing it would do the most damage. She had been wrong about the number of enemies in this war. She had been wrong about which one was the most dangerous. And she had 48 hours to become a completely different kind of fighter than the one she had spent 4 months being, because the instruments she had been using, the legal architecture, the financial mapping, the succession clause, the court orders, All of it had just become the evidence of her visibility. And visibility was the one thing she could no longer afford if she was going to survive what was coming through her door. She put the phone in her pocket. She started walking. She did not know yet exactly what the next 48 hours required her to be, but she could feel it forming. Something harder than patience, something colder than strategy, something that lived in the part of her she had spent 20 years keeping very carefully contained, because it was the part her father had warned her about. Not the part that planned, not the part that calculated, the part that, when everything else was stripped away and the instruments were gone and the architecture had collapsed, simply decided. Her father had called it the last room. The place inside a person where there were no more options to weigh, no more approaches to consider, no more elegant solutions to construct. Just the thing you were willing to do when the alternative was losing everything. He had told her she had it. He had told her to be careful with it. He had told her that people who went into the last room too early never came back the same, and that people who refused to go in at all didn't come back at all. She had spent 20 years not needing it. She needed it now. She walked 3 blocks to a parking garage she knew, one that had no cameras on the second level because she had noted this 8 months ago for a reason she could not have articulated then, but that seemed now like the kind of thing a person notes when some part of them already understands that the future will require it. She stood on the second level in the concrete silence, and she let herself think the thought she had been keeping at the edges of everything. Renato Luca had the federal investigators. He had the immunity agreement. He had the Faro documentation. He had 48 hours of lead time and a cooperating witness agreement that made him untouchable through conventional legal means. But he had one vulnerability. One thing he had not accounted for, because it required knowing something about the Bellini Trust that only 2 people in the world knew. Adriana and her father's second attorney, the one her father had trusted completely. A man named Thomas Carver, 71 years old, semi-retired, living in a house outside the city that she had visited exactly once 12 years ago for reasons unconnected to any of this. Her father had said, "One of the 2 men I trust completely." Luca was the one he wasn't sure about. Carver was the other one. Carver had co-drafted the succession clause, which meant Carver knew something Luca did not know Carver knew. The secondary provision, the one her father had whispered to her in the hospital room with the particular urgency of a man running out of time to say important things. The provision that did not appear in the filed document, that existed only in the original sealed instrument, that Luca, in all his 15 years of patient preparation, had never found, because her father had inserted it after Luca had completed his portion of the drafting in a private session with Carver alone. A provision that, if presented to the right authority within 48 hours, made Luca's immunity agreement structurally void. Adriana took out her phone. She found Thomas Carver's number. Her thumb hovered over it. She pressed call. Thomas Carver answered on the 3rd ring. He sounded like a man who had been awake, which meant he had been expecting the call, which meant he had been following the news cycle from his house outside the city and had understood, with the particular clarity of a man who had spent 40 years in trust law, exactly what the public filing of the succession clause meant and what would happen next. "You know why I'm calling," Adriana said. "Yes." His voice was dry and careful and very old. "You used it." "I had to." "I know." A pause. "Luca filed with the federal investigators tonight." "You know about that too." "I've been watching Renato for about 2 years." The way he said it, flat, almost tired, told her this was not new information he was delivering, but old weight he had been carrying. "I didn't have enough to move on him, and I didn't know, until tonight, until I saw the federal disclosure on the wire, that he had the Faro documentation." "Where did he get it?" Carver was quiet for a moment. "From me," he said. The parking garage was very silent. Adriana heard her own breath. "Explain that," she said. Her voice was the flattest it had ever been. 3 years ago, he came to me. Professionally, collegially, the way he does everything. We had lunch. He asked questions about the Bellini trust structure, framed as academic curiosity, and I answered more than I should have because I trusted him more than I should have. He didn't get the secondary provision. I never discussed that. But during that conversation, I mentioned the Faro matter tangentially, in a context I believed was protected. I was wrong. A long pause. He recorded the lunch. He built from what I gave him, and he found the rest through his own investigation. I only understood this about 8 months ago, when I found a reference in one of his shell company documents that could only have come from what I'd said. Adriana stood in the concrete dark and absorbed this. The source of the Pharaoh documentation was Thomas Carver, not as a willing participant, as an unknowing one. Luca had done to Carver exactly what he had done to everyone else, found the gap, inserted himself, extracted what he needed, and left the person holding consequences they didn't understand. "Does the secondary provision still hold?" she asked. "Yes. He doesn't know it exists. I'm certain of that. Can you get to the city by morning?" "I'm already in the car," Carver said. He arrived at Elena's office at 4:53 in the morning, a tall man gone thin with age who moved carefully and carried a leather briefcase that looked like it had been with him for 30 years. Elena met him at the door. Adriana was already inside, standing at the window with the first gray light beginning to come up over the city. Carver set the briefcase on the table and opened it and took out a document in a sealed envelope that was visibly old, the paper slightly yellowed at the edges, the seal a dark red wax that had hardened and contracted over 15 years. "Your father had me hold this separately," he said. "Never filed, never registered, never entered into any system Luca had access to. He told me to give it to you when you needed it, and not before." He set it on the table. "I should have given it to you sooner. I'm sorry." Adriana looked at the envelope. She did not touch it yet. "What does the secondary provision do, exactly?" Carver sat down. He folded his hands on the table with the precision of a man organizing his thoughts. "The primary succession clause voids the deceptive party's financial privileges. You know this. You filed it. What Luca doesn't know is that your father inserted a secondary provision in this separate instrument that does something different." He paused. "It designates a secondary trustee authority. In the event that the succession clause is challenged or suspended through any legal mechanism, including a drafting party review petition, the secondary trustee authority activates automatically and assumes full administrative control of the trust pending resolution." "Who is the secondary trustee authority?" "The Commission," Carver said. "Specifically, a 3-member oversight panel drawn from Commission membership, designated by your father in a separate private agreement with the 4 senior commissioners active at the time of drafting. 2 of those commissioners are still active." Adriana finally picked up the envelope. It was lighter than she expected. The wax seal was intact, unbroken, the impression in it still sharp despite 15 years. Her father's ring. She recognized the pattern. "If Luca files the drafting petition," she said slowly, "and the succession clause goes into procedural limbo, the secondary provision activates before the suspension takes effect. The commission panel assumes trustee authority, and a commission-held trust cannot be subject to a creditor claim by a party who has already been identified as acting in bad faith against it. That's established commission precedent, not statutory law. Luca's entire Meridian claim structure collapses the moment commission authority activates." Elena, who had been listening from the far end of the table, said, "He can't challenge commission precedent in federal court. It's outside federal jurisdiction entirely." "Correct," Carver said. Adriana set the envelope down. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Carver. "My father knew Luca might try to use the drafting petition." "Your father knew Luca was the one he wasn't sure about. He didn't know specifically what Luca would do, but he understood the category of threat." Carver's eyes, tired and old and very clear, held hers. "He built a door that Luca could never open because Luca didn't know the door existed." The room was quiet. Outside, the city was beginning to come back to life. The distant sound of early traffic, the particular quality of light that was neither night nor morning but the seam between them. Adriana thought about her father in the hospital room, the specific effort it had cost him to speak clearly in those last weeks, the way he had made her sit close so he didn't have to raise his voice. The things he had told her, one by one, with the care of a man transferring something irreplaceable. She had thought, at the time, that he was being thorough in the way he was always thorough. She understood now that he had been seeing something she couldn't see from where she was standing, a threat he had identified 15 years before it fully formed, that he had built a defense against, and then given her the key to without explaining what the lock looked like, because explaining the lock would have meant naming Luca, and naming Luca would have meant a confrontation that would have destroyed the defense before she needed it. He had trusted her to find the lock herself. She picked up the envelope. "I need to be in front of the commission panel in 6 hours," she said. With this document, Sophia's phone, Marcus's financial mapping, and Elena's legal analysis of the drafting petition. She looked at Elena. "Can you get me 4 hours of sleep somewhere in this building? There's a couch in the back office. Wake me at 9. Idiot." She did not sleep. She lay on the couch in the back office with her arm over her eyes, and her mind running the sequence forward and backward. Every step, every contingency, every point at which something could go wrong, and what she would do if it did. She had done this all her life. It was not anxiety. It was preparation, the kind that happened below the level of conscious thought, the kind her body did automatically when it understood that what was coming required everything she had. At 8:47, she got up, washed her face, looked at herself in the small mirror above the sink in the office bathroom. The woman in the mirror looked like she had not slept, which was accurate. She looked like she had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, which was also accurate. She looked, she thought, like someone who was about to finish something. The commission panel convened in a private room in a building in the financial district that was owned by a holding company that connected through 3 degrees of separation to a structure the commission had maintained for decades for exactly these purposes. The room had no windows, a long table, 5 chairs, 4 for the commissioners Aldo had assembled, 1 for Adriana. She had not expected the 5th person in the room. Vincenzo was sitting at the far end of the table. He looked like he had not slept in 2 days, which she estimated was probably accurate. He had not shaved. His suit was the same one he had worn at the banquet, which meant he had not been home, which meant something about his situation in the 48 hours since the banquet had made home feel unsafe or impossible. He looked at her when she came in with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not calculation, not the practiced authority he wore like a second skin. He looked diminished. "He asked to be present," Aldo said from his seat at the table. "I made the decision to allow it. If you want him removed—" "No," Adriana said. She set her briefcase on the table and sat down. She looked at Vincenzo directly. "He should hear this." Vincenzo said nothing. His hands were on the table, flat, and they were very still in the way that hands are still when the person they belong to is holding themselves together through conscious effort. She laid it out for the commission, all of it, in sequence, with the precision she brought to every presentation she had ever made in a room full of powerful men, which was, she reflected, most of the presentations of her life. The financial mapping Marcus had built, Elena's analysis of the drafting petition, Sophia's phone, which Grace had opened at 7 that morning, and which contained 41 separate communications between Luca and Sophia documenting his coordination of her introduction to Vincenzo's organization, the meridian structure, the 4-year timeline, the federal disclosure and immunity agreement, and then the envelope. She broke the seal in front of them. The sound of the wax cracking was very small in the quiet room. She read the secondary provision aloud. Carver, sitting beside her, confirmed the authentication. The 2 commissioners who had been active at the time of the original drafting looked at each other across the table with the expression of men recognizing something they had agreed to long ago and then set aside and not thought about since. Commissioner Reyes, who had said nothing until this moment, a compact man in his 60s who had the particular authority of someone who rarely spoke and was therefore always listened to when he did, said, "The secondary provision is valid. We confirm it." The second original commissioner, Diamante, nodded once. "Confirmed." "Then Commission Trustee Authority activates," Adriana said, "pending the resolution of the divorce proceeding and any federal investigation connected to Vincenzo's operation." Aldo looked at the table, then at her. "The federal investigation. Your name is in Luca's disclosure." "Adjacent to Vincenzo's operation," she said, "not as a primary subject. And with the Commission now holding trustee authority over the Bellini Trust, the investigator's ability to use the trust as a vehicle for reaching me is significantly constrained. Luca's immunity is based on the completeness of his disclosure. He disclosed Vincenzo's operation and the meridian structure. He did not disclose the secondary provision because he didn't know it existed. His immunity agreement is built on a representation that his disclosure was complete. She paused. If it can be demonstrated that he had prior knowledge of the trust structure sufficient to construct the drafting petition, which the 11-year-old filing Marcus found establishes, and yet failed to disclose his own role in designing the authorization gap that Vincenzo used, his immunity agreement has a material omission. She looked at Aldo. A material omission in a federal cooperating witness agreement is grounds for vacating the agreement entirely. The silence in the room was very complete. Reyes said quietly, "You're going to give the investigators Luca." "I'm going to give them what the evidence shows," Adriana said, "which is that the person who designed the fraud was not Vincenzo. Vincenzo was a vehicle, the architect of the scheme, the man who identified the vulnerability, built the mechanism, placed Sophia, constructed the Meridian creditor claim, and then flipped to federal investigators with a disclosure carefully crafted to implicate me as a peripheral subject, is Renato Luca, and his immunity agreement does not cover the crimes he didn't disclose." Vincenzo made a sound, not a word. Something that was not quite a word, a short exhale that carried in it something Adriana had not heard from him in a very long time. She looked at him. His face had done something complicated. The diminished quality was still there, but something else had come into it. Not the old authority, nothing like that, but something rawer and less constructed. The expression of a man understanding in real time the complete shape of what had been done to him. "He built the whole thing," Vincenzo said. His voice was rough, the way voices get when the person using them has been awake for too long and has spent that time with something they couldn't put down. "He came to me 18 months ago with the trust plan, told me it was an opportunity, walked me through every step." "He designed every step," Adriana said. "He needed you to execute it so the fraud would bear your name when it surfaced. He needed me to respond to it the way I did, so I would be in motion when he went to the investigators. He needed the succession clause to surface publicly so he could challenge it, create the procedural window, and let Meridian establish the creditor claim in the gap." She paused. "He needed both of us. You as the instrument, me as the target." Vincenzo looked at her across the table. The quality of that look. She would think about it later, in a quieter moment. It was not an apology. There was no framework in which Vincenzo Caruso would sit across a table from the woman he had publicly humiliated and offer an apology. But it was something. The look of a man who had understood something about the architecture of his own life that he had not understood before, and who was sitting with what that understanding felt like. "What do you need from me?" he said. A recorded statement. Everything Luca told you, showed you, facilitated. Every conversation, every document he provided, every instruction. Marcus will take it. She paused. "And your son." Vincenzo's jaw tightened. "Leave Matteo out." "He called me," Adriana said, 2 days ago. He wants to testify to the commission about the organizational structure. He has documentation from inside the operation that corroborates Marcus's financial mapping. I didn't ask him. He called me." Something moved through Vincenzo's face that was too private to look at directly. She looked at the table instead, giving him the 4 seconds it required. "He's 24 years old," Vincenzo said. "He's 24 years old and he's been watching his father's organization for 2 years and taking careful notes," Adriana said. "He didn't get that from you." The room held very still. Commissioner Reyes set his hands on the table. "We need to move. Luca will know within hours that the secondary provision has been activated. The commission filing is not sealed. When he understands his immunity agreement has a material omission, he'll run," Marcus said from the doorway. He had arrived at some point during the presentation, quietly, the way he did everything. "He has resources. Offshore accounts the federal disclosure didn't cover because he structured them outside the Meridian umbrella. He's been building an exit for at least 2 years. "How long before he moves?" Adriana asked. "If he sees the commission filing," Marcus checked his watch. 6 hours. Maybe less." Adriana looked at the commission panel, at Aldo, who was already reaching for his phone, At Reyes, who was nodding with the contained efficiency of a man shifting into a mode of operation he had not used in some time but had not forgotten. At Carver, who sat quietly with his old leather briefcase and the look of a man who had been carrying something for 15 years and had finally set it down. At Vincenzo, who was already pulling out his phone to call his son. She reached into her briefcase and took out the last document, the one she had prepared herself the previous night in the apartment in the Meridian district, in the hours between Marcus's call and Carver's arrival. A formal referral package addressed to Special Agent Dana Kessler of the Federal Financial Crimes Division, whose name she had obtained through channels she would not document. The package contained everything: the complete picture of Renato Luca's 4-year scheme, the material omission in his immunity agreement, the secondary provision, the Meridian structure, the 11-year-old filing, Sophia's communications, Marcus's financial mapping, assembled in the precise sequential format that federal investigators used internally, because she had obtained a copy of that format and had used it, because if she was going to hand them a case, she was going to hand them a case they could move on immediately without spending 3 weeks organizing it. She slid it across the table to Aldo. "Get this to Kessler before Luca sees the commission filing," she said. "I want federal investigators at Luca's office before he understands what's happening." Aldo looked at the package, then at her. "You built this last night. Between 2 and 4 in the morning, while you were supposed to be sleeping." "I don't sleep well," Adriana said. She stood up. Every person in the room watched her do it. The commissioners, Marcus, Carver, Vincenzo. The particular quality of attention that a room gives to someone who has just demonstrated something that the room is still processing. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A message from Elena. "Luca's office just filed the drafting petition. 7 minutes ago." He had moved faster than she expected, or he had moved at the time he had always planned to move, and she had simply miscalculated his timeline by 7 minutes. She looked at the message for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked at Aldo. "How fast can you get that package to Kessler?" 20 minutes. "Luca filed the petition 7 minutes ago. He'll see the commission response to his filing within the hour. When he sees the secondary provision activation in the commission response, he'll know the petition failed before it started," Reyes said, "and he'll run." She picked up her briefcase. 20 minutes, Aldo." She was already moving toward the door when Vincenzo said her name. She stopped, turned. He was standing. He looked like what he was. A man who had lost everything, who understood exactly why he had lost it, who was sitting inside that understanding with no way to argue against it because the argument would require him to be a different person than the one who had made every decision that led to this room. He looked like a man without a performance left to give. "The banquet," he said. "The nameplate." She waited. "I knew what I was doing," he said. "Luca told me it would send a message. I knew what message it would send. I chose to send it." A pause. "I want you to know that I know that." Adriana looked at him. The man she had married 20 years ago, who had needed her in every way that mattered and had understood none of them, who had been used as a weapon by a man more patient and more intelligent than either of them had known, and who had, in the specific calculus of how much of his own destruction he owned, still owned enough of it to matter. "I know you know," she said. She walked through the door. The corridor outside was empty and fluorescent lit and smelled like any other office corridor in any other building in the city, and she walked through it with her briefcase in her hand and her heart hitting a tempo that was slightly above its resting rate. Not fear, not exactly, but the particular physical register of a person who has set something irreversible in motion and is now living in the gap between the action and its consequence. She pushed through the door at the end of the corridor and stepped into the stairwell and took the stairs down instead of the elevator because she needed the movement, needed the physical cadence of descent, needed something her body could do while her mind ran the final sequence. Luca had filed at 7 minutes ago. The commission response, with the secondary provision activation, would hit the court system within the hour. Aldo was moving the federal package to Kessler. Marcus was already outside, she knew, coordinating with the 2 investigators he had a back-channel relationship with. Not official, not documented, but real. The kind of relationship that existed in the specific space between what was legal and what was necessary and what got done when the official channels moved too slowly. She hit the ground floor, pushed through the exterior door. The morning air came at her, cold, sharp, the city fully awake now, indifferent and continuous. Her phone rang. Marcus. Kessler received the package, he said. 12 minutes ago. Aldo moved faster than 20. Luca? His assistant called a car service at 9:41, not his regular service. A different company, paid in cash through a third party. The car is scheduled for 10:15. A pause. He's going to the airport. Which terminal? International. Of course. He had the offshore accounts. He had the exit. He had been building it for 2 years. How long to get federal agents to the airport? Kessler is moving now. She needs the material omission formally documented in a sworn instrument before she can detain. That takes Carver, Adriana said. She was already moving. Carver can execute a sworn instrument in 20 minutes. He was the co-drafter. His sworn attestation to the secondary provision and Luca's omission is the instrument Kessler needs. I'll call him. Marcus. She stopped on the sidewalk. Around her the city moved. If Luca gets on that plane, he won't. She stood with the phone against her ear and the morning light coming hard off the glass buildings and the cold working through her coat, and she did the thing she almost never did, which was let someone else hold the outcome for 30 seconds. Let Marcus hold it. Let Aldo hold it. Let Kessler and Carver and the federal instruments and her father's secondary provision and 15 years of patience hold it. Then her phone buzzed with a second call. Elena. Judge Delacroix just issued an emergency stay on the drafting petition, Elena said, and her voice had something in it that Adriana had never heard there before. The secondary provision activation supersedes it. The succession clause stands. Adriana closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. And Luca? She asked. 3 seconds of silence. Then Marcus's voice, cutting across from the first call, still open in her other ear. Federal agents made contact at the terminal. He's in custody. The sidewalk was solid under her feet. The city moved. The morning light held. She stood on the sidewalk for a long time after the calls ended, not because she needed to, not because there was anything left to do in that moment that required standing still on a city sidewalk with cold air coming through her coat and the morning light hitting the glass buildings at an angle that made them look almost clean. She stood there because she was allowing herself something she had not allowed in 4 months, which was the specific sensation of a weight leaving the body. It did not feel the way she had imagined it would feel. It did not feel like triumph or relief or the clean satisfaction of a thing completed. It felt like the moment after you have been holding your breath for a very long time and you finally exhale, and what comes after the exhale is not comfort, but simply the awareness of how long you were not breathing. She started walking. She had nowhere specific to be for the first time in 4 months. The next phase, the federal proceedings, the divorce litigation, the commission's formal restructuring of the trust administration, would take months and would require her presence and her attention and the specific quality of stamina that long legal and institutional processes demand. She understood this. She was prepared for it. But that was later. That was the machinery of consequence, running forward on its own momentum now, and it would be running whether she stood here or not. She walked 6 blocks to a diner she had passed 100 times without entering. She sat at the counter. She ordered eggs and coffee and toast, and she ate all of it, slowly, tasting it in the specific way you taste food when you have been running on almost nothing for long enough that eating feels like a decision rather than a habit. The man behind the counter refilled her coffee without being asked. She thanked him by instinct. He nodded and moved down the counter to the next customer and did not look at her again because she was just a woman eating breakfast in a diner, which was exactly what she needed to be. Renato Luca was processed through federal custody on a Tuesday. Adriana was not present. She had given her sworn statement to Special Agent Kessler the previous Friday, 4 hours in a conference room at the federal building, with Elena beside her and a court reporter taking everything down in the particular silence of official proceedings. She had answered every question completely and precisely. When the questions approached the edges of the Pharaoh matter, Elena had redirected twice, and Kessler, who was a careful and intelligent woman who understood the shape of what she had been given and how to protect its integrity, had not pushed. The Pharaoh matter was addressed separately. Adriana had requested a private session with Kessler and a senior DOJ representative without counsel, which Elena had argued against with everything she had. Adriana had sat across from Elena in her office and waited until Elena finished arguing and then said simply, "I need them to hear it from me before they hear it from anyone else. That is the only version of this that I can live with." Elena had looked at her for a long moment. Then she had said, "I'll arrange it." The private session lasted 2 hours. Adriana told them what had happened 9 years ago, completely in sequence, with the same precision she brought to everything. She told them what she had done, and why, and what the consequences had been, and where the documentation lived. She did not minimize. She did not frame. She told them the truth the way you tell it when you have made peace with it, which is without decoration. At the end of the session, the DOJ representative, a man named Garrett, who had the tired eyes of someone who had been in these rooms for a very long time, looked at his notes and then at Adriana and said, "You understand that I can't make any commitments today." "I'm not asking for commitments," Adriana said. "I'm asking you to have the complete picture. What you do with it is your decision." Garrett looked at her for a moment with the specific expression of a person recalibrating something. "You didn't have to come in without counsel." "No," she said, "but it was the right thing to do." He said nothing to that. She did not need him to. 3 weeks later, Elena called to tell her that the DOJ had closed the Faro inquiry without action, citing insufficient prosecutorial interest given the totality of circumstances and Adriana's voluntary cooperation. Elena read the formal language and the clipped tone she used when she was managing relief that she did not think it was professional to express. "Good," Adriana said. "That's all you've got? Good? What would you like me to say?" "I don't know," Elena said. "Something that acknowledges this was not a guaranteed outcome." "I know it wasn't," Adriana said. "I knew it when I walked in without you. Some things you do because they're right, not because they're safe." There was a pause on the line. "You're a very difficult client," Elena said, and underneath the professional composure was something warmer than that, something that had been building over 4 months of this particular working relationship and that neither of them felt the need to name. "I know," Adriana said. "Send me the bill." Renato Luca's immunity agreement was vacated 6 weeks after his arrest, on the basis of the material omission Thomas Carver's sworn instrument had established. The vacating was not dramatic. It happened in a court filing on a Wednesday afternoon, a document among documents. The legal system processing the consequence of a man who had built his exit on a foundation with a hidden crack. His federal charges, reconstituted without the immunity protection, included wire fraud, conspiracy to commit financial fraud, abuse of fiduciary position, and 4 counts of obstruction related to the original disclosure. His attorney, a different attorney, someone who had not spent 11 years being paid to be trustworthy before revealing that he was not, entered a not guilty plea that no one in the room believed. Adriana read about the arraignment in a news summary that Marcus sent her. She read it once. Then she put her phone face down on the desk and went back to the document she had been working on, which was the restructuring plan for the Bellini Family Trust. Not the legal restructuring, which Elena was handling, but the operational restructuring. The question of what the trust was for now that it was no longer quietly financing the survival of a criminal organization whose head did not know it was doing so. That question, it turned out, was the most interesting one she had faced in years. She met with Matteo Caruso on a Thursday afternoon in the small conference room of a law office that neither of them had any connection to. He arrived before she did, which told her something about him that confirmed what she had already suspected. He was 24 years old, and he had his father's build and his mother's eyes, which were Adriana's eyes, and he stood up when she came in the room in the automatic way of someone who had been raised with certain habits and had kept them. "Sit down, Matteo," she said. He sat. He had a folder in front of him, organized, tabbed, the documentation he had referenced in his call to her. He pushed it across the table without preamble. "Everything I observed over the past 2 years, dates, communications, financial patterns, I had a forensic accounting professor at my university look at the financial material without context. His assessment is in the back. She looked at the folder. She did not open it yet. Why did you take notes for 2 years without coming to me sooner? He was quiet for a moment. Because I wasn't sure what you would do with it. Whether you would use it to protect the organization or to protect yourself or... He stopped. Or whether I was part of it. Yes, he said, simply. No apology for the honesty. She found she respected it. And what changed your assessment? The banquet. He looked at the table and then back at her. The way you left. You didn't run, and you didn't cry, and you didn't threaten him. You just left. And then the next morning the accounts were frozen, and I understood that you had been preparing for a long time, and that the only thing you had prepared for was ending it, not controlling it. He paused. You weren't protecting the organization. You were protecting yourself from it. She looked at him for a moment. 24 years old, his father's build, her eyes, and something that was neither of them. Something quieter and more careful. The product of watching two people who were very powerful and very flawed navigate a marriage that had been both genuine and catastrophic. What do you want? She asked. Not for me specifically, in general. What do you want your life to look like? He seemed slightly surprised by the question, which told her it was not one he had been asked often. Architecture, he said. I've been studying it. I want to build things. A pause. Real things, not... He gestured vaguely, a gesture that contained in its vagueness the entirety of what he had grown up inside. Then build things, Adriana said. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple. The complicated part is everything that tries to make it not simple, and you're already through most of that. She opened the folder. She looked at the first page. The documentation was thorough and precise and organized in a way that demonstrated a mind that noticed things and recorded what it noticed without editorializing. She thought about her father, about the specific quality of attention he had brought to every room he ever entered. Your grandfather would have liked you, she said. Matteo looked at her. Something moved through his face, not sentiment exactly, but the acknowledgement of something. There's a Bellini Foundation scholarship program I'm establishing, she said, without looking up from the folder. Specifically for urban development and architecture students. The first cohort starts next year. You'd be ineligible to apply because of the conflict of interest. She turned a page. But the program director position, for someone with direct knowledge of the communities the foundation is targeting, someone who grew up inside the specific intersection of money and power and neighborhood impact that shaped these areas. She looked up. That's a different conversation. Matteo was very still. Think about it, she said. No obligation, no family debt, a straight offer based on what I've just seen in this folder and what I heard in your voice when you called me. She closed the folder and slid it back to him. Keep the originals. Marcus has copies. She stood up. He stood up with her. Mrs. Caruso, he said, then stopped because the name had an obvious problem in the present context. Adriana, he said, trying it. Yes. What happens to my father? She thought about Vincenzo in the commission room, the diminished quality, the thing he had said about the nameplate, about knowing what message it sent and choosing to send it, the specific honesty of a man who had nothing left to protect and had therefore stopped protecting. The commission has stripped his operational authority permanently, she said. He retains personal assets that aren't connected to the Bellini Trust. There are some. He'll be comfortable. He'll spend the next several years navigating the peripheral fallout from the federal investigation, which his cooperation has substantially reduced. She paused. He'll be a man who used to run something. That's not nothing for certain kinds of men. It's enough to build a life around if you're willing to let the old life go. Is he willing? I don't know, she said honestly. That's his question to answer. She picked up her bag. At the door, she stopped. Matteo, the notes you took for 2 years, the forensic accounting analysis, the documentation. She turned. You did that alone. No one told you to. No one backed you up. She held his gaze. That took a specific kind of courage. I want you to know that I saw it. She left before he could respond. Some things landed better without an answer. The divorce was finalized on a gray morning in November, in a courtroom that smelled like old wood and recycled air, in a proceeding that lasted 40 minutes and concluded without drama because there was nothing left to contest. The asset division had been resolved through mediation over the preceding 3 months, the Commission's trustee authority having effectively removed the largest and most contested elements from the divorce proceeding entirely by placing them under a jurisdiction that family court could not reach. Adriana sat beside Elena and listened to the judge read the formal dissolution. The language was dry and sequential. 20 years of marriage reduced to its legal components and separated into columns. She felt nothing dramatic. She had expected this, had known since the night she signed the divorce petition that the finalization would feel like this, quiet and complete, the closing of a door that had been standing open on a room she had already left. Vincenzo was not present. His attorney accepted the final decree on his behalf. Outside the courthouse, Elena said, "It's done." "Yes." "How do you feel?" Adriana looked at the street. The November sky was low and uniform, the kind of gray that was not threatening but simply present, the sky doing its work. "I feel like I have a lot of work to do," she said. Elena made a sound that was almost a laugh. "That's the most you I've ever heard you sound." The charity gala was held in February on a Saturday in the ballroom of the Caruso estate, which had reverted to Bellini Trust ownership as part of the asset resolution, and which Adriana had leased back from the trust for the evening at a rate that would be donated to the foundation's first community development project. She had made this decision deliberately. She had sat with it for a while, the question of whether returning to this specific room was something she needed to do or something she was doing because it was symbolically convenient, and she had concluded that the distinction didn't matter as much as she had thought. The room was a room. She had arranged it beautifully the first time. She would arrange it beautifully again. She had arranged it differently. The flowers were different, white and structural rather than the lush dark arrangements of 20 years of Caruso aesthetic. The lighting was cooler. The tables were arranged to maximize movement and conversation rather than to establish hierarchy. There was no head table. 260 guests, political figures and business leaders and development advocates, and 3 university presidents and a delegation from a community organization in the Westfield district, the first neighborhood the foundation had committed to working in, a neighborhood that had been shaped for 30 years by the specific combination of neglect and criminal economy that the Bellini Trust had quietly helped to sustain. They were there because Adriana had gone to them first, before she had finalized the foundation structure, before she had the full legal authority to make commitments. She had gone and sat in a community center on a Tuesday night and listened for 2 hours before she said a single word about what she was planning. She had learned something in those 2 hours that was worth more than most of what she had learned in the preceding 4 months of legal warfare. She had learned what the money she had spent 20 years managing had actually cost at the ground level, in the specific texture of daily life in a neighborhood that had been treated as an operational convenience by people who lived nowhere near it. She carried that with her into everything that followed. Eleonora Fanti arrived at 7:15 and found Adriana near the entrance and held both her hands for a moment without speaking. The grip said what it said. Adriana received it and returned it, and they stood that way for a few seconds before the evening required them to move. Thomas Carver arrived with his wife, a small woman who looked at Adriana with the specific warmth of someone who had heard about her for a very long time. Carver himself looked lighter than he had in the commission room, lighter in the way that people look when they have set something down they had been carrying past the point where carrying it made sense. He shook Adriana's hand and held it for a moment and said, "Your father would have," and then stopped. "I know," Adriana said. Marcus Webb arrived without a date and stationed himself near the back of the room with a glass of sparkling water and the particular expression of a man who was professionally incapable of attending any event without quietly assessing its security vulnerabilities. Adriana caught his eye across the room at one point, and he lifted his glass slightly. She nodded. It was enough. Sophia Marchetti had not been invited. This was not cruelty. It was the recognition that there are things that people need to do separately, that healing and the remaking of a life do not happen in the company of the circumstances that required the healing. Sophia had cooperated fully with the federal investigation. She had been a witness, not a defendant. She had gone back to legal practice, a small firm, civil work, nothing adjacent to the life she had briefly moved through. Adriana had received a letter from her in December, a single page, handwritten. She had read it once and put it in a drawer. Some things you acknowledge privately and left there. At 9:47, Adriana stepped outside onto the terrace that ran along the east side of the ballroom. The February air was cold enough to see her breath. The estate grounds were lit the same way they had been lit the night of the banquet. String lights through the bare winter trees, a detail she had kept because it was beautiful and because she did not believe in erasing beautiful things because they were associated with difficult ones. She heard the door behind her open. She did not turn immediately. She already knew. Vincenzo was wearing a coat she did not recognize, which meant he had bought it recently, which meant something about him was continuing to move forward through time in the ordinary way that time requires. He looked better than he had in the commission room. Not the way he had looked 20 years ago, not that, but present, assembled, the specific quality of a man who had survived something and had decided, in the aftermath of surviving it, to be present for what came next. He stood beside her at the terrace railing. They both looked out at the grounds. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I know. Why did you?" He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that in 20 years she had learned to read. Not evasion, not construction, but the actual work of a man who was not naturally given to honesty, trying to be honest. "Because it's right," he said, "and because I spent a long time doing what was useful instead of what was right, and I'm trying to recalibrate." She looked at him. The profile of a face she had spent 20 years reading. She did not feel the things she might have expected to feel. Not the old warmth, not the bitterness that had come later, not the cold, strategic clarity of the preceding 4 months. She felt something quieter than all of those things, the feeling of a woman looking at a chapter that had ended and recognizing it as a chapter. Complete, bounded, real, over. "Matteo told me about the foundation scholarship," Vincenzo said. "It's not named for the family," she said. "I want to be clear about that." "I know, he told me." A pause. "It should be. It's Bellini money." The Bellini name has its own complicated history with those neighborhoods. The foundation work needs to stand on what it does, not on who funded it. She paused. "The point is the neighborhoods, not the name." He nodded. He seemed to be turning something over, working towards something he had come here to say. She waited. "The Capos had a meeting last month," he said. "Without me. That hasn't happened in 22 years. He said this without bitterness, or without the kind of bitterness that needs to be expressed as such. Just as fact. Aldo moderated it. They voted to formally reorganize under a different structure, more distributed, less centralized, less vulnerable. A pause. One of the senior lieutenants, Ferrante, you know him, stood up in the meeting and said something. He stopped. She waited. He said, "They never really followed me. They followed the stability you built." He looked at the grounds. Aldo told me afterward, "I've been sitting with it." "How does it sit?" "Badly," he said, "and accurately." He exhaled, a slow breath that visible in the cold air, there and gone. "I had everything, the empire, the loyalty, all of it, and I didn't see what was holding it up because what was holding it up didn't make noise. You never made noise." "No. That was a mistake I made, assuming quiet meant unimportant." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "It was." They stood in silence for a while, not the silence of things unsaid, but the silence of things that had been said as completely as they were going to be said and were now simply present between them, neither resolved nor unresolved, just true. "You should go back inside," he said. "It's your evening." "It's not my evening," she said. "It's the Foundation's evening. I'm just here to make sure it runs correctly." Something moved through his expression. Not quite a smile, not quite its absence. She turned and went back through the terrace door and did not look back. Inside at 10:15, the Foundation's executive director, a woman named Claudine, who had spent 15 years in community development and who had looked at Adriana across a desk 3 months ago and said, "I'll do it, but I run the programs, you run the board, and we agree on both of those functions in writing before I sign anything. Which was the moment Adriana had known she had the right person. Claudine stood at a small podium near the center of the room and spoke for 8 minutes about the Foundation's first-year commitments. No ceremony, no awards. 8 minutes of concrete plans for specific places and specific people, delivered in the direct language of someone who cared about outcomes more than about the appearance of caring. When she finished, the room applauded, not the performed applause of charity events, but something more immediate than that, the sound of people who had heard something real. After Claudine spoke, a man named Bernard from the Westfield Community Organization said 6 sentences that contained more weight than most speeches Adriana had heard in a lifetime of rooms like this one. He talked about his block, about the specific quality of growing up in a neighborhood where money moved through and nothing stayed, about what it felt like to be in this room and hear plans that included his neighbors' actual voices in their construction. 6 sentences. He did not thank the foundation by name. He simply described what the plans meant and then sat down. Adriana stood near the back of the room and listened, and did not speak. This was deliberate. She had learned, slowly, imperfectly, through the particular school of having been invisible for 20 years in a way that was involuntary, and then choosing visibility in a way that was strategic, that there was a third thing, beyond invisible and visible, that was harder to achieve and more valuable. The thing where you had built something real and then stepped back far enough that the thing could run on its own, that it did not require your presence at its center to remain itself. Her father had understood this. He had built the trust as a structure that would outlast him, that had its own logic and its own protections, that would continue doing what he designed it to do regardless of whether he was alive to direct it. He had been right about almost everything. He had been wrong about one thing. He had trusted Renato Luca enough to include him in the drafting, even when he wasn't sure. He had compensated for the uncertainty by building the secondary provision in private. A beautiful solution, an elegant solution. The solution of a man who understood that you plan for the people you're not sure about. But he had still let Luca into the room. She had thought about this many times since November, about what her father had seen in Luca, or thought he saw, about the specific human failure of trusting someone based on the evidence available at the time and being wrong, about the fact that this was not a failure of intelligence or care, but simply of the limits of what any person can know about another. She had thought about what she would do differently. The answer, every time, was nothing. You built the best structure you could with the knowledge you had. You anticipated the gaps you could identify. You left a key for the gaps you couldn't. And you trusted the people who came after you to find the key when they needed it. That was all anyone could do. It was enough. It had been enough. At 11:30, the last guests began to leave. Adriana stood near the entrance and said goodbye to each of them in the specific way she had always said goodbye. Name, eye contact, one sentence that was particular to them and demonstrated that she had been paying attention. She did this for 40 minutes. She was not tired. She was the least tired she had been in years. When the room was nearly empty, she walked back through it alone. The string lights were still on, the tables half cleared, the particular silence of a room after a successful evening, full of something that wasn't quite sound but registered like it, the residue of 260 people having been present and now being absent. She stopped in the center of the room. This was where the head table had been. 20 years of anniversaries, of formal dinners, of gatherings in which she had been the invisible architecture that held everything upright while being seated consistently in the position that communicated something other than what she actually was. She stood in the center of what had been the head table and looked at the room, at the configuration she had designed, without hierarchy, without a head, equal distances from every wall. And she understood something she had been moving toward for a long time. She had not won by destroying what Vincenzo had built. She had not won by surviving Luca's architecture or exposing his scheme or activating her father's secondary provision. She had won earlier than all of that. She had won the moment she decided, 4 months before the banquet, that she was done building things for other people to stand in front of. Not because the building was wrong. She was still building. She would always be building. It was the most natural thing she did and the thing she was best at, and she had no interest in stopping. But she was building her own thing now. under her own name. For purposes she had chosen in full light, with full knowledge, and with the specific, irreversible commitment of a woman who has looked at everything she spent 20 years constructing and understood both how much of it was genuinely good and how much of it had been built on a foundation of her own willingness to remain unseen. She was done being unseen. She turned off the last of the string lights herself, because the staff had been there since 4 in the afternoon, and she had sent them home, and she was capable of turning off a light. She walked through the dark ballroom toward the exit, and the dark was fine, and she knew exactly where the door was, and she went through it into the cold, clear February night. She did not look back at the building. There was nothing behind her that she needed to see. The car was waiting. Claudette, patient as ever, who had been with the Bellini family for 11 years, and who said nothing unless she was asked, and who somehow managed to communicate, in her silences, that she understood the things she was not saying. Adriana got in. The door closed. The estate moved past the window. "Home?" Claudette asked. Adriana thought about the apartment in the Meridian district, the desk, the window that looked over the river, the bed she had not slept well in for 4 months, and that tonight she thought she might actually sleep in. "Home," she said. The gate opened. They drove through. The road ahead was dark and straight and entirely hers.